With this message, I wanted to look at the issue of where does meaning lie when it comes to the Old Testament? Does the ultimate and true meaning of an Old Testament passage exist in the Old Testament text, or do we need the New Testament to be able to tell us what the real meaning is of the older passage? And so that's going to get us into the issue of passage priority versus New Testament priority. So this is a pretty big issue when it comes to the debate between dispensationalism and then those that would be non-dispensational, often what you would see with amillennialism or postmillennialism, or often even within covenant theology. You're going to have dispensationalists who are going to argue for what we will call passage priority when it comes to understanding the Old Testament. And then those that are not dispensational will argue for what oftentimes is called New Testament priority. So this is an important issue. It obviously relates to Bible interpretation. It relates to hermeneutics. And then the decisions that are made on this issue will also have an impact on theology. Largely the reason that dispensationalism and covenant theology and amillennialism and postmillennialism are telling different storylines when it comes to the Bible from Genesis through Revelation is because they have different understandings on how to understand Old Testament text. So that's what we're going to look at here. Is we're going to look at the difference between passage priority and New Testament priority. This is mostly a stating and laying out of the difference. Perhaps later videos we can go into a lot more detail looking at specific passages and the like, but this is basically setting out the difference between the two approaches. We want to ask the question, where should we look to find the meaning of Old Testament passages, and in particular Old Testament passages that are prophetic passages about the nation Israel, what we could call restoration of Israel passages involving Israel, the land, physical blessings, geopolitical nations, those passages that involve a lot of physical, tangible national entities. So when we come to New Testament priority, what this particular approach is going to claim is that the New Testament needs to be the lens or the perspective by which we truly understand Old Testament passages. So thus New Testament priority asserts that Old Testament passages can only be truly understood through the lens or the perspective of the New Testament. So sometimes people will explicitly state that they're holding to New Testament priority. You can go online and type that in on a search, and you'll see there are some non-dispensationalists who actually use that terminology of New Testament priority. Others that do not use that particular title will still use the concept. But if you ever hear people say things like, well, in order to understand the Old Testament, we have to use the New Testament to interpret. Some will even use the word reinterpret. We'll see George Ladd was oftentimes use the word reinterpret when it comes to what the New Testament does to the Old Testament. And there'll be times where people will say, well, the Old Testament is primarily types and shadows. They're inferior, shadowy things that give way to better New Testament realities. So sometimes people will appeal to types and shadows in the Old Testament. And then there are some who will say that the New Testament actually spiritualizes the Old Testament. So when you hear that sort of language, we're often dealing with the issue of New Testament priority, where Old Testament passages will have to be viewed through the lens of the New Testament, even if the meaning seems to differ from what the Old Testament actually was claiming. Just to give you an example here, George Ladd, a very famous mid-20th century theologian, many people follow his line of thinking today. He was a representative of non-dispensational theology. He was very critical of dispensationalism. And he said, here is the basic watershed between a dispensational and a non-dispensational theology. Dispensationalism forms its eschatology by a literal interpretation of the Old Testament and then fits the New Testament into it. A non-dispensational eschatology forms its theology from the explicit teaching of the New Testament. So here he's looking at both sides. And he says, dispensationalism forms its eschatology, its view of end times, by a literal interpretation of the old. And then he says, then fits the New Testament into it. As a dispensationalist, I probably don't like those exact words, but generally what he's saying is dispensationalists take literally Old Testament passages. And then notice the last part of this where he says a non-dispensational eschatology forms its theology from what? The explicit teaching of the New Testament. So according to Ladd, he's not looking to literal interpretation of Old Testament text in their own historical, grammatical, literal context. He's looking for what the New Testament states in order for him to find his theology. And then, he also went on to say, George Ladd did, that the Old Testament must be interpreted by the New Testament. So that's definitely New Testament priority language there. He says, in principle, it is quite possible that the prophecies addressed originally to literal Israel, describing physical blessings, have their fulfillment exclusively in the spiritual blessings enjoyed by the church. It is also possible that the Old Testament expectation of a kingdom on earth could be reinterpreted by the New Testament altogether of blessings in the spiritual realm. And so that is a classic statement of New Testament priority there, because what he's saying is there may be Old Testament passages that talk about literal Israel and physical blessings, but those can be fulfilled with the new true Israel, the church, and then therefore physical blessings actually could become spiritual blessings. And it's also possible, that prophecies concerning a kingdom on earth could be reinterpreted by the New Testament. So that's a classic statement of New Testament priority there. As a matter of fact, when George Ladd was looking at Peter's statements in Acts chapter 2, Ladd claimed that Peter's words, quote, involves a rather radical reinterpretation of the Old Testament prophecies, but no more so than the entire reinterpretation of God's redemptive plan by the early church. So that's also a strong statement of New Testament priority there. Ladd actually uses the language of radical reinterpretation. So he believes that the New Testament, and in the case of Peter with Acts 2, allegedly radically reinterprets Old Testament prophecy. So you do see that a lot with non-dispensational theology, where promises concerning Israel, national Israel, land, physical blessings, and even geopolitical nations and those kinds of tangible things can be reinterpreted by the New Testament. And then that would appear to introduce strong discontinuity into the storyline, because New Testament fulfillment would actually be quite different than the original Old Testament expectation. Richard Gaffin just straight out says that hermeneutical priority belongs to New Testament statements. So that's a very clear statement. So really what we're getting here with the non-dispensational New Testament priority approach is the fact that we can't just look at Old Testament passages in their own context. They must be interpreted or reinterpreted through the lens of the New Testament. And therefore, when there are passages like Isaiah 11 or Zechariah 14, or even Isaiah 49, which talks about the restoration of national Israel, passages involving the land of Israel, passages talking about an earthly kingdom of the Messiah. Those passages need to, according to the non-dispensationalists, or at least a lot of them, be given a different understanding, because allegedly the New Testament is investing those passages with a different, more spiritual meaning. So now Robert Strimple, who is also holds to this concept of New Testament priority, when he was defending the amillennial view of the kingdom in the book 3 Views on the Millennium and Beyond, which I recommend for all of you to read. It's a great book. It's a great debate book between the 3 millennial views: amillennialism, postmillennialism, and premillennialism, as he defends amillennialism and its more spiritual understanding of Messiah's kingdom and spiritualization of Old Testament prophecies. He asked the question here, but is it correct to interpret such Old Testament prophecies as descriptions of a future millennial kingdom that Christ will establish on this earth at his second coming? To answer that, the crucial question the Christian must ask, of course, is this: how does the New Testament teach us to interpret such passages? So that's interesting there, coming from Strimple, is that he's not just going to assume the meaning of the Old Testament prophecies about a future earthly millennial kingdom of Christ. The crucial question for him is to ask, well, how does the New Testament teach us to interpret such passages? Now, for those that who do not hold to the New Testament priority approach, that question may not be as obvious. For somebody like myself, I would just say, well, I think the assumption is the Old Testament passages are inspired by God, and they are revealing real information and revelation. They make contributions on their own. Maybe the issue is we're going to see the New Testament is in harmony with the literal meaning of those Old Testament passages. So it's for those that are not New Testament priority, that is not necessarily a crucial question that must be asked, any more than we would say, oh, we need the later Gospel of John to be able to reinterpret the earlier Gospel of Mark or Matthew. Nor do we say, hey, well, we need Paul's later letters to be able to understand his earlier letters. Now, I know it's a little bit different when you're coming from Old Testament to New Testament. But some would say maybe the assumption is that we should see these as harmonious and not needing one testament to tell us what the meaning is of another testament. So as we come to the issue of passage priority, let's discuss what we mean by this title. When dispensationalists refer to passage priority, this is referring to the fact that the meaning of any Bible passage is found in that passage. So with passage priority, the issue is that the meaning of any Bible passage, no matter where it is found, is actually found in that passage, whether it's in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, whether it's a passage about narrative or wisdom, or a prophetic text about Israel and Israel's land and physical blessings, or whether it's a New Testament passage. So basically, passage priority is the view that the meaning of any passage in the Bible is actually found with that passage. And then when all the passages are understood according to their context, we will see that they harmonize and fit perfectly together. And you don't have any testament or any passage reinterpreting another passage or investing another passage with the meaning that goes contrary to the original meaning. So we will say when it comes to passage priority, wherever it is found, a passage, a Bible passage, contributes to God's purposes in its own context. So each passage gets to contribute to the Bible storyline. That is why God placed that text in the Bible. Now, later Revelation might comment on a passage, and that often happens, or draw principles or significances or applications from it. And we do see that a lot with New Testament quotations of the Old Testament. Or there may be a connecting of a promise in the Old with fulfillment in the New, such as the inauguration of the new covenant predicted in Jeremiah 31 with what Jesus is establishing in his blood with Luke chapter 22. But we are going to see, though, is that later revelation does not reinterpret or change or alter the meaning of earlier revelation. Meaning in a text is found in that text, and we can discover its meaning via grammatical, historical interpretation that discovers the original authorial intent. And when all meanings of all Bible passages are understood correctly, we will find that they harmonize because divine inspiration guarantees that. So passage priority claims that because God inspired all Scripture, that all Scripture makes a contribution and thus is not in need of any later passages to come in and tell us what the original meaning was. And so those who hold a passage priority like to say, God got it right the first time. There doesn't need to be any kind of reinterpretation or alteration to the original meaning. Again, since all Bible passages are from God and harmonize with each other, each Bible passage makes a contribution to God's purpose on its own. And therefore, when you're studying a passage, even if it is an Old Testament prophetic passage, you can know that there's meaning there that God has put there. And that by studying that passage in its context, you can see how that passage contributes to the storyline of the Bible. So when Isaiah chapter 2 talks about that in the kingdom of God that takes place on earth when God's ruling from Jerusalem, there will actually be international peace among the nations to such a degree that they will lay down their weapons of warfare. When Isaiah chapter 11 verses 6-9 talk about the animal kingdom being restored, that's exactly what will take place in the kingdom. When Zechariah 14 talks about the Lord rescuing Jerusalem from attack in the last days, and verse 9 of Zechariah 14:9 says, the Lord will be king over all the earth, and in that day his name will be the only one. And then it talks about him ruling the geopolitical nations of the day, that passage is communicating just that. I remember one time listening to a non-dispensational theologian who was looking at Zechariah 14, and he said, well, if you were to take that passage literally, it would seem to teach the premillennial dispensational idea of a future for Israel and an earthly kingdom of the Messiah. But we just know that the New Testament is going to treat that as types and shadows. And when I heard that, I didn't think that was right. I think that we can study Zechariah 14 in its context, and that seems very harmonious with the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24. It seems very harmonious with what takes place with the second coming of Jesus in Revelation 19 and the kingdom in Revelation 20. So with the passage priority approach of dispensationalism, there's no need for one Bible passage to interpret another Bible passage because they all get to contribute in their own context. What John Feinberg says here is he says New Testament application of the Old Testament passage does not necessarily eliminate the passage's original meaning. No New Testament writer claims his new understanding of the Old Testament passage cancels the meaning of the Old Testament passage in its own context, or that the new application is the only meaning of the Old Testament passage. The New Testament writer merely offers a different application of an Old Testament passage than the Old Testament might have foreseen. He is not claiming the Old Testament understanding is now irrelevant. And then he also goes on to say that when it comes to this issue of testament priority, that non-dispensationalists, who would be different from John Feinberg on this, but non-dispensationalists begin with the New Testament teaching as having priority and then go back to the Old Testament. Dispensationalists often begin with the Old Testament, but wherever they begin, they demand that the Old Testament be taken on its own terms rather than reinterpreted in the light of the New Testament. I think John Feinberg is right as he makes that statement there. Again, we're trusting in God that all of it's going to harmonize, all of it's going to make a contribution. Of course, we do know there is a sense in which the New Testament is a fuller, completer revelation. We now see how things come all together in the person of Jesus Christ via his two comings, his first coming and his second coming. There is going to be information revealed, like concerning the afterlife, that we didn't get in the Old Testament that we will in the New. There are details about the salvation that Gentiles now have as they're in union with Christ. In the Old Testament, we were told that Gentiles would be saved someday, but the beauties of Ephesians 2:11 through 3:6, which talk about Gentiles being fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and all these rich truths that salvation brings to both Jews and Gentiles, we see details in the New Testament that are much greater than we do in the Old. But understanding, and by the way, I would also add too that in the New Testament, particularly Matthew chapter 13, we learned specifically that there's going to be two comings of the Messiah to earth. I think that was hinted at in the Old Testament, but the New Testament tells us that there's actually going to be two comings. I think that's the message of Matthew chapter 13. So we affirm all of that there's many great new things that are being revealed in the New Testament, but that does not mean the New Testament reinterprets the Old. We actually believe that the Old is harmonious with what is taking place in the New Testament. Darrell Bock, who is a dispensationalist who has addressed these issues as well, when he was in a debate book, when he was responding to a non-dispensationalist on this issue of, which testament do we use to understand what's going on and with the Old Testament. He was addressing New Testament priority when he made this statement. So Darrell Bock said the claim of New Testament priority is a subversive retrojection of the New Testament back to the Old that actually loses some of what the inspiring God had committed himself to doing. No amount of pleading on behalf of a certain type of typology can deny this linguistic canceling effect on the text. The result is not a unifying of scriptural teaching, but a negating and limiting of what God affirmed, resulting in a reductionist reading of the text. And Bach has noted that oftentimes with New Testament priority, things like national Israel and physical blessings in the land of Israel have been removed from their significance in the storyline. And so that is a taking away from the Bible storyline. Paul Feinberg, also a dispensationalist, when he was addressing these issues of testament priority, he said the claim that one's hermeneutic for Old Testament predictions must grow out of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament is sufficiently ambiguous that almost anyone can affirm it and mean by it whatever they so choose. And by the way, this is a good point that Paul Feinberg's making here, and we do need to clarify this. Those that believe in passage priority, like myself, we are not claiming Old Testament priority over the New Testament. So let's keep our terms correctly here. So there's one camp that is saying, the non-dispensational camp usually, that the New Testament has priority over the Old Testament. And then what we are arguing for, the dispensational view, is that we should believe in passage priority, where the meaning of every Bible passage, no matter where it's found, is found in that passage. Now, when it comes to the issue of Old Testament priority over the New Testament, dispensationalists do not believe this. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is sometimes I've looked at works that have said that, oh, you do not believe in New Testament priority, you believe in Old Testament priority. You believe the Old Testament imposes itself on the New so that the New can't speak to what it is saying. And we are not saying that. We are not saying the New Testament has priority over the Old when it comes to meaning, or that the Old Testament has priority over the New. And so John Feinberg, as a dispensationalist, makes this clear. He says, the Old Testament economy must not be forced upon the New. There must be allowance for genuine progress in divine revelation and salvation history. On the other hand, it is equally as egregious an error to impose the New Testament on the Old as though there was some need to Christianize it. And I think that's a good statement there. That's how come we're affirming passage priority, which avoids the errors of New Testament priority or Old Testament priority, because we let every passage be able to make a contribution to the Bible storyline. So as we start to wrap our discussion on this issue up, we just want to assert that dispensationalism argues for passage priority, in which the meaning of each passage is found in that passage, which means that each passage has a voice. Each passage gets to speak to the issue it addresses with no need of reinterpretation. And practically, this means that when you are studying a text, no matter where it is, you can study it in its own context, knowing that its meaning is found there, and that meaning contributes to God's purposes. So in other words, if you're studying a passage in Joel 2 or Amos 9 or Isaiah 9 or wherever, you can study that in its context and be confident that you're going to come to, if you're using good hermeneutics, you're going to come to a meaning that remains, and the New Testament will not change that particular meaning. Plus, that meaning harmonizes perfectly with later revelation and the Bible storyline as a whole. All right, that summarizes our discussion on passage priority versus New Testament priority. Now, there are many issues that could be discussed with this. We basically just offered an introduction to it, but we just did want to reaffirm that this area is a big area of distinction between dispensational theology and non-dispensational theology. As dispensationalists, we believe in passage priority and believe that New Testament priority oftentimes leads to incorrect conclusions concerning the Old Testament and the Bible storyline as a whole. If you did want more information on the issue of passage priority versus New Testament priority, I do have a fairly new book called Dispensational Hermeneutics. It's interpretation principles that guide dispensationalism's understanding of the Bible storyline. So if you did want to go into deeper waters when it comes to discussing this issue, you might want to check this book out. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you later.